What's up, everyone? It's Dark coming at you with another episode of Startup Engineering Daily. Let's hop right into it. So our first story for today is from this guy, Milo Smith. I don't know what, but I have seen his name before, and a few people are following him, at least that I follow, but he has this update that is speculative, but is fascinating, where he's talking about Cluely, which, if you're unaware, is the, cheating as a service where it'll, you can do an interview and you have it in the top right corner. It'll give you the answer to questions that the interviewer is asking you. Started by this guy, Roy, who is, very known, is actually highly respected because he gets very cost-effective views, essentially, on all of his videos, but they're very controversial and they're but he's saying that it looks like Cluely is almost fully out of money. They've removed all affiliates other than Roy himself and Neely, who I guess is the co-founder and COO. And he says those badges cost $50 a month. He thinks they're spending too much on engineers since most of them have the original 400K pay package. As you can see here, originally they were paying $400 to $1 million base, $250 to $300. It's pretty interesting because a lot of people are actually coming out of the woodworks in reply to this tweet, basically defending Roy. However, when he first got started and when Cluely first got launched, there was a lot of hate. So I don't really care one way or the other. I feel like my mentality on just builders in general has evolved where I'm much more supportive of just anyone starting companies these days. But it is interesting, it kind of speaks to the idea of is all news good news? Using controversy to grow your company and versus figuring out product market fit. They do have a good product, which is helping you learn essentially or cheat. These kind of depends how you use it, which will make the most of it. But obviously they're selling to a kind of malicious use case, but pretty interesting. I don't know where they'll be. Apparently too, Milo says that they failed to raise a Series B in late 2025. So that may be interesting. I don't know if they're going to have to shut down or if they're going to raise some debt or something is also what he was kind of hinting at. Okay, and next we have a tweet from Maor Shlomo, who is the creator of Base 44. If you hadn't heard of it, my friend actually put me onto it a few weeks ago when we were but because Maor is a solo founder which is similar to Lovable and those kinds of companies where you can just prompt and get an app out, but it does have back-end connections and other pieces. And he sold it to Wix for $80 million, but as a solo founder, and also I believe he sold it after 8 months of founding. That's quite impressive, obviously. But you can see that since Wix has acquired it, it's actually now past 100 million ARR and is growing faster than ever. Makes us one of the fastest companies to do so without VC backing, especially. Kind of a win for Wix where they acquired this. I know Wix, the web platform, I'm not a huge fan of it. They do have some problems with DNS. They kind of lock your account. You can't do custom DNS, and the UIs themselves are a bit dated from what I remember. They're in the game and a lot of people still use them and they have a lot of brand recognition, and they're also Israel based, of course. So there's politics aligned with that, and also Maor is Israeli. So who knows where that goes. Who knows what the connection there is, but very fascinating, very successful company, and it's a vibe coding platform, but it does have backend connections, and all of these platforms are kind of leaning towards making it so that you can build proper apps, which is the right direction. People don't really want to build toys, they want to build things that other people can use. And the internet is the Wild West as always, where anyone will try to take advantage of you wherever they can, especially if payments or secure credentials or API keys are involved. So just very interesting. We'll have to keep an eye out on this, but very cool how, he won on his exit, but also Wix is winning with the. And then next we have something that's been huge news. I'm sure if you're tapped in at all, CalAI has been acquired by MyFitnessPal. CalAI is an app where you can scan food and you can track it and, try to achieve your weight loss or weight gain goals using their system. So it's very similar to MyFitnessPal, but the main piece that they figured out is that you can take a picture and you can use AI. I'm not sure which models they're using, but my guess would be Gemini just because of how cheap products, and that's kind of my recommendation for products because you can get it with Gemini Flash for 40 cents per. But obviously there is a quality trade-off there, so it would be interesting to know what model. But nonetheless, they got acquired by MyFitnessPal. There's actually a huge interview on this guy Brett's YouTube channel. I forget what his name is fully, but super fascinating YouTube channel because it talks about startups, but it also mainly focuses on the marketing and the growth, which is a big weakness of mine. I'm pretty solid on the engineering side, but very bad on the monetization and growth and marketing plays. But you can see here in just 18 months, they broke 50 million ARR along the way. Also, I believe in January, they did 5.7 million in revenue, which would be about 60 million plus ARR for the year of 2026. So they haven't gone into specific deal numbers of how much they got acquired for, I guess, but it is being estimated that it's sold from anywhere between 150 to $200 million. Also very fascinating in the interview that he did, he mentions that they had, as well as a full-time virtual assistant team, but it's interesting because they did kind of market it as they were just a squad of a few kids who were building this app, but as it developed, it became a much more streamlined system. They also talked about how for the past 12 months, I believe, they've been communicating with MyFitness, a long negotiation process. I wonder if they were just going back and forth on the numbers or what they were figuring out. But also he said there's no retention or anything, so I believe he is just leaving the company and they're taking it over and just going to blend it into MyFitnessPal. However, it will still be a separate app. And just really cool what they were able to achieve. They figured out the AI play at the very beginning, And, congrats to them. And it'll be interesting to see what he does moving forward. Because he did say as well that it's like, he's figured out how to make a 50 million ARR company, but he doesn't know how to make a 100 million ARR company. So there's just levels to this, and it'll be very interesting to see what he. Okay, next we have some very interesting tech. When I first saw it, I was super excited to cover it, but then unfortunately I had to see this tweet, which is basically calling it. But essentially, this company called D-Valence launched, which they say can scan for microphones and essentially block them and jam them. So they have a demo in the video. I won't play it, but once they press this button on the device, what you would be hearing if you were watching this video is essentially they're talking, but it just sounds like fully static, so you can't hear anything they're saying. And somehow they scan for microphones in the area, and when you press this button and you turn on this device, then nobody can record you. So very fascinating. However, unfortunately, this guy MG, who has a cool Twitter name and a pretty interesting domain, so I don't know what he does exactly, but seems to be kind of, and he's basically saying ultrasonic mic jammers are real and a fraction of the price, but using AI to detect mics is very problematic. And he just goes through all the different technologies you can use, like wireless protocol discovery. But he's saying basically that this product could not exist as being claimed. So I don't know the technology around it. I'm not into hardware at all. I focus mainly on software, but it is a really cool idea, and maybe it is a bit of a scam, but we'll have to wait. Okay, next we have a tweet from Guillermo, and a lot of people have been covering this as well, but Google has shipped a CLI for Google Workspace, an official CLI. So crazy to think about, in the late 2010s, this was, you had to use the Sheets API and stuff if you wanted to access those kinds of things. And I guess for a product you would still need it, but it was very hard to work from the terminal or from Google was very focused on their web experience, but they didn't care so much about the developer experience. But now in the age of AI, in the age of agents, CLIs are so much more. It kind of gives the agent a way to operate with these services with a defined help, and also you can paste the docs quite easily. Obviously, there's still a debate between what's better, CLIs versus MCP servers, and I don't know the answer to that yet. I think both of them are very valuable, but nonetheless, they have released a CLI, so you can access Drive, Gmail, Calendar, Sheets, Docs. I don't know exactly what the authentication looks like yet, but it may be OAuth or something similar. But also they bundled it with some skills as well, which is pretty. Guillermo says 2026 is the year of skills and CLIs. He leaves out MCPs, which is interesting. Obviously, they're not talking about MCPs. Obviously, Google didn't launch an MCP here, but it would be interesting. And yeah, if you're doing stuff that works with Google, like OpenClaw, for example, could definitely leverage this. And okay, next we have a very interesting tweet from Rhys Sullivan, who formerly worked at Vercel and also before then worked at Microsoft, but has now been poached by OpenCode and is working there. And he has an interesting tweet where he says, skills solve the agent knowledge problem at the wrong level of the stack, and I'm hoping that it's not too late to undo the damage over time. I guess that's kind of like a leave Vercel and then start hating on skills kind of thing. But he's saying for 90% of skills, they're basically your existing docs with a small tweak to tell an agent how to do the op. An example of this is call this API endpoint to set a DNS record rather than press this button, which is correct. You want to use APIs as opposed to using, it's much more resource intensive to scaffold a website that an agent can interact with. And he says the reason skills worked is because they gave local search, discoverability, but those were solved problems already via Google. It's just no one has really solved search for agents. So instead we ended up with skills. And now when we look at the problems that exist with them, versioning, auto updating, I agree with this a lot. You just download a skill from a GitHub and it's I thought skills definitely made a lot more sense in the cloud. However, no one has really, but maybe there's an interesting idea there. But he said these are problems docs have already encountered and solved via, /v1 routes for your different docs. You get better discoverability and internal linking to pages. This is also interesting because the markdown files associated with skills don't. However, if you, or in an Obsidian type format, which can contain links and can effectively show pretty links, but also just make them for the agent. So just paste the link directly. I don't think there's anything negative with that, but obviously, there is a lot more infrastructure that comes along with actual HTML pages. He says where skills are nice is it gives people the ability to publish things like React best practices, which would have been just on a personal blog that'd be hard to find. So things like skill.sh, which is from Vercel, are a good discoverability perspective. But he's unconvinced that a scattered array of GitHub repos is the right long-term solution. Especially, I agree with this as well. It's even this point at the end, it's React already has a best practices documentation page. So I don't know why that really doesn't negate his point, but definitely interesting. We're still at the very early stages of these things, but skills are very cool. Obviously, Vercel did that study where they showed that if you use skills versus just putting all the context in Agents MD, so you have to keep that in mind as well when working with skills, is that you're kind of inherently handicapping yourself just for kind of nicer optics or nicer ergonomics. But the industry is for sure going to evolve over the. Okay, next we just have a little like fluff piece, to be honest, from Planetscale about how much they like Bugbot. They say 80% of the Bugbot comments are addressed by users and that the reviews are top notch. I actually agree with this. I think Bugbot is quite good. If I had to rank them, I would say Copilot is the worst. And I haven't used Graphite as much, but I have heard good and bad things. I know that they kind of got hyped at the beginning, but as far as I've heard, I think their quality has degraded a bit, but would be interesting to hear more about that. But I think Bugbot and CodeRabbit are like very top of the funnel and very solid. They do really great comments and they think deeply, whereas Copilot is just like very surface level and honestly recommends things that are incorrect sometimes. So that's unfortunate, but just cool to see Planetscale is using it. They do say that like they need to keep production. I don't know how true that is. I don't know how feasible that is, but it is a good goal to set, obviously, to avoid bugs at all costs, and Cursor does help with that a lot. So it kind of speaks to the point as well of like, when are we going to get past human code review, and are we just going to let AI push things to production? I do let AI write all of the code like everyone else, but once it gets to the PR, I'm actually reviewing every single line, I'm reviewing every single comment from Cursor, and I like to preemptively send some Cursor comments just to make sure everything's straight. But I do also try to review the PR without any of the AI review as well, just for like kind of practicing myself, recognizing things that are important to me versus just kind of delegating that brain power to. That's still where humans are important, and like driving coding style or naming or using the right terminology, for example. I think some of these things get missed and are very specific to the individual business you're working on. However, I do think these AI review tools are very solid, but it'll be interesting to see when we get to a point, kind of like Cursor was investigating, where they had like, if there was a certain confidence level that they had with the review, that they would, which I think is valid, like certain things like UI, very small like copy changes are never going to break prod, so those are easily revertible, versus like database things that require migrations or pipelines, and all of those pieces are going to be much longer until we can approve those and deploy them without any human intervention. But still kind of interesting, and the blog isn't that interesting, but I thought it was just kind of a cool topic to. Okay, and then next we have a tweet from this guy Apoorv Agrawal. I don't know who he is exactly, but I guess he used to be engineering at Palantir, which is very cool. And he's saying at the MSTMT conference, I don't know this conference, but I guess it must be high level. He's talking about how obviously Anthropic had the Department of War, where they actually got labeled as a supply chain risk. I don't know if that's been reverted or if that's still in place, but they have mentioned that they're going to try to work with the Pentagon to. And there was I forget if it was CNBC or who it was, but he said, they were the first LLM to be on the to be like on the classified cloud. So they did work directly with the government, but of Dario and Anthropic being very specific about like, we do not want AI to make decisions of life or death. We always need a human to press the button and take accountability, which makes sense. But also, we're heading to a future where that's not going to happen anymore, unfortunately. But they tried to block it, and then they got labeled as supply. But they are trying to work together again. And he said on AI acceleration, we did not see ourselves hitting a wall. This year will be radical acceleration that surprises everyone. And we are the precipice of something incredible. We need to manage it the right way. And they did just raise $30 billion, so obviously they're very incentivized to keep the growth going, to make sure they don't ever hit a down round, which if they ever don't reach the growth metrics that they have, the whole company is going to collapse, which is just kind of the game of high leverage, not even just in startups. And they said now they're at $19 billion run rate, even though they were at $100 million run rate 2 years ago. I would like to see the comparison of ChatGPT versus Anthropic, because there was the drama over the Super Bowl ads where ChatGPT was like, we have more users in Texas than Anthropic has, period. But since the Claude Code explosion and people growing to like Claude as an LLM, it would be interesting to see the updated. But nonetheless, I know some people are getting fed up, and obviously like the models sometimes have regressions, it seems, or we're just becoming more aware of what they obviously say that they don't. So they do kind of just call us like conspiracy theorists for believing that. But, I don't really have any evidence, so there's nothing we can say. But it is interesting to see how the game is evolving. And I'm sure they will get back with the government. I know ChatGPT took advantage of that, and now OpenAI is working directly with the Department of War. I don't know if they also feel that they can have autonomous weapons that don't have any human intervention. I'm not sure if Sam has spoken on that, but definitely. Okay, and then next we have a tweet from James Cowling, who's the CTO of Convex. If you're not familiar with Convex, it is a serverless function platform similar to like Lambda, but also supports a database. So it's kind of like a new age Firebase, and it's completely real time out the gate. So that's super awesome. I'm a huge fan of it. I use it for pretty much all of my new apps. It does have some nuances compared to Postgres, even though it is built on top of Postgres on Planetscale, but like there's no joins really and like different functionality like that. However, it is fully transactional out of the gate. That's like kind of the cool thing of like their functions, which are mutations and queries, and then their database calls are all like transactional out the gate, and it's using like optimistic concurrency control, I believe is what it's called, OCC. But they did have an outage today. It lasted about 2 hours, starting this morning at about 9:30 a.m. And my app that I was using, Convex, was completely down. We also use Convex Auth, which is served from their server, so you couldn't even get into the app, period. And that Convex had downtime for some customers. I hate when they say this because it was like all customers except for EU, I think. So maybe it is just some customers, but it was a massive amount of customers. And they blame it on an anomalous load spike that pushed an internal service into load shedding mode, which then triggered an unexpected panic in a caching library they were using, which is very interesting. He talks about the technology behind this. I'd never heard of this, but he says specifically the load triggered 2 queue management algorithms, CoDel, which I guess is like delete, which proactively drops requests to keep queues small, and adaptive LIFO, which dequeues in reverse order to avoid wasting time on old requests. These are both rather subtle algorithms that large services use to avoid congestion collapse under high load or attack. The panic in the caching library was just a bug that depended on both of these algorithms simultaneously. They said they've made some changes, and the key lesson is that services should try to avoid switching logical behavior during high load, which makes sense, but it's also like you kind of need to test these things ahead of time. But this seems like a very complicated issue, so I don't know that I can speak to it, and maybe it just would have happened. And he does say distributed systems are hard and their team is typically, but sometimes problems happen, which is the truth. You're going to have outages. I wasn't too worried about it, but definitely if it was like more of our peak time for our users, it would have been very problematic. However, so it was not as problematic that there was, and you couldn't access the app effectively. It is interesting, this idea that like at a high load, you basically just start dropping requests to keep queues small, which I think like if you kind of use like these big platforms, you might see that sometimes where it's like, oh, I couldn't log in, or like, oh, this request just didn't work. I wonder if it is using CoDel to make that happen or some similar algorithm. But nonetheless, their transparency has gotten better. The previous time they had an 25, and they were pretty non-transparent about it. They didn't update their status page until it was fixed, I believe, which took about an hour or so, or maybe a couple hours. It's always cool though, because I go in the Discord and I end up making friends. So I kind of benefit from it in that way, but obviously it's not worth the trade-off there. But since then, they have become much more transparent. They updated the status page within about 30 minutes, as opposed to like waiting until it was over. And then the CTO, James, came into the Discord as well and gave a bit of an update. And he also posted the update here on Twitter. So it seems like they have worked on those systemic things and the visibility. And I do still recommend Convex highly. So hopefully they can maintain their reliability. This is kind of like the slop era. It's so unfortunate. If you look at like the Claude status page, the ChatGPT status page, the GitHub status page, I think they're all like in the 98% uptimes, which is so crazy to think about in 2026. Like if you look to when AWS originally came out and they had like obviously that's for storage, that's not for uptime, but I think they have 3 nines for uptime. How far we've regressed, but we're also delivering much more features than ever, so it's kind of a trade-off there. But I do think eventually we are going to kind of revert back to focusing on stability as opposed to, but I guess in this example, it wasn't even feature delivery. It was like a DDoS or an anomalous load spike. Would be interesting to see where that's coming from, but we'll just have to keep an eye out. But I still have it. And then last, we just have this tweet from Guillermo. This was big news as well a few days ago, but I just wanted to make sure we cover it today. But the Vercel Dubai region on AWS was completely taken down because of the war with Iran that's going on, and the tons of the political stuff around that, but we'll leave that. But essentially the Middle Eastern AZ2, so availability zones there. So like he says here, they're designed to have independent power, physical security, fire suppression, and logistical operations. So once one of the AZs went down, if you have a multi-AZ setup, which is for high availability, according to AWS, like you don't need to be multi-region to be highly available. You just need to be multi-AZ, then you would have been unaffected. However, there was an update on this story that basically all of the Dubai region is down now. Essentially because of bombing is my understanding. It would be interesting to know like how close the data centers are to each other, or if the data centers were targeted specifically, or if they're just close to military bases or use similar like military infrastructure in Dubai specifically. And so the Middle Eastern region is down for now, and Vercel is automatically rerouting that traffic to other regions. I don't know how much like downtime there are other services. I guess by now they probably could have cloned over to other regions, but I know it's not the easiest thing in the world, but just like war and political conflict and just physical can affect these services. And I think this is the first time that a data center has been blown up like this, but it would be interesting to know if there's some history around that. We'll have to keep an eye on it, and just crazy world. And that speaks to like, you never know what to plan for, and the more redundancy you can have, the better, but obviously there's trade-offs and cost and risk, so it's hard to say. But if this kind of stuff interests you and you want to talk with some like-minded people, join the Audinato Discord in the description. Thanks.